Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. My name is Vidya Ananthakrishnan, and I co-direct the Columbia Justice Lab's Youth Justice Initiatives team. We aim to create a world where all youth, especially youth of color and those who have long been marginalized, have the opportunities and supports they need to grow, flourish, and thrive in their own homes and communities outside of the legal system. Today's panel on developing a shared vision is the fourth in our Taking On Transformation series, which outlines key steps for system leaders across the country to consider as they shift away from the youth prison model and create a community-centered approach. Achieving this type of transformation takes commitment and an intentional focus on key values that guide where we're headed, including being laser focused on equity and racial justice and keeping youth, families, and communities at the forefront of all that we're doing. We also know that this work of transitioning to a world without prisons will look different for different places across the country, especially as they grapple with varying constraints and contexts. That said, there are some important bold steps that will be common along these journeys, including closing youth prisons, directing funds away from incarceration, investing resources in the communities most impacted by incarceration, and creating spaces for those who are most impacted to design and lead efforts to create safety. Our Taking On Transformation project attempts to demystify and share how system leaders can move these efforts forward at a practical level, outlining steps and ideas to get started. Today's webinar is co-hosted by the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice, an affinity group of current and past youth justice administrators calling for an end to youth prisons and pushing for investment in communities. This conversation will dive deeply into the crucial topic of creating a vision for transforming youth justice that is shared by all the stakeholders needed to push it forward. This discussion will build on our previous conversations about the foundations for transformation, beginning with and focusing on racial justice and partnering with system impacted youth and their families. Before diving into today's topic, we wanted to thank our funders and partners without whom we could not do this work. I also want to remind everyone that even though this will remain a closed panel, we will aim to reserve time at the end for the panelists to answer questions. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature in your webinar control panel to submit questions at any time throughout the discussion, as we may not see questions posted directly into the chat. Lastly, we will record this event and post it on our project website at takingontransformation.org, where you can also watch our past panels. We're going to kick off today's event with a short video from our partners at Performing Statistics, who collaborate closely with incarcerated and system impacted young people to amplify their voices through art and advocacy. We hope this video really helps set the stage for our upcoming discussion. And afterwards, I'll introduce our moderator for today.
Child, you wouldn't believe what it was like back then. If I tried to tell you, you couldn't wrap your head around it. Kids in cages, like animals, tearing families apart, making kids go through things I don't even want to speak about. These were children they were locking away. We were so young back then. We took to the streets and we used our voices in ways we only imagined. We dreamed this future into its very existence. And now it's your turn. What do you dream of doing next?
In the world without youth prisons,
I
I walk down the street and
I hear happiness in the community.
And I feel safe. No fear.
no violence.
No cries.
no sirens.
I see communities thriving,
Outreach available,
happiness,
positivity,
children being healed instead of hurt.
families growing together instead of being torn apart.
Cycles and chains are being diminished.
I see a community that is working to build with the people
With the people,
rather than against them.
rather than against them.
Youth getting the help they ask for, people being cared for.
I can feel the wind blowing past me.
And I feel free and at ease.
It's like the feeling you have after crying.
when you've had the chance to let it all out or to finally let someone in.
I see happiness all around me.
Kids are running around, flinging water balloons,
Gasping for air because they laughing too much. Families are together.
talking about their past, about their dreams.
creating memories they can hold on to without fear.
I feel sunlight on my face.
And warmth from all the hugs.
I want to be like a water lily.
Like a willow tree.
Like an aloe plant.
Healing wounds people didn't even know I could see.
I smell the grass, the trees, even the air.
Nature is all around.
Nature's all around.
It's fresh and fills my lungs.
Fresh like avocados.
Like lemons.
Like a cooling cucumber.
I feel free and full of peace.
Because I hear the laughter and joy of children.
Who will never experience the inside of a cell.
Never experienced the trauma I went through.
I see youth becoming who they are destined to be. I see money that would have went towards putting youth in cages.
That is now being put into the school system.
Into jobs, into support for kids.
It sounds simple, but it's not. Now we can finally feel free just to be kids.
To experience, not survive, our childhood.
To smile, knowing I could be myself.
To sleep, knowing our loved ones will be home when we wake.
To dream, knowing we can shape our future.
Yeah, we accomplished the impossible. We removed those chains that held our community back.
And when we finally healed.
When we created this world you see,
it was beautiful.
Like nothing else you've ever imagined. Like 1,000 monarch butterflies flying high up into the sunset.
we can love ourselves.
We can shape our future.
We can finally heal.
We are together. We are safe.
We are free.
Thank you so, so much to our partners at Performing Statistics for sharing that. It always makes me smile when I get to watch it, and I hope it brought some joy to all of you. I'm now going to turn things over to Gladys Carrion, our moderator for today's discussion. Gladys is the co-chair of the Youth Correctional Leaders for Justice, as well as a senior fellow at the lab. She's a former New York State and New York City Commissioner for Child Welfare, Youth Justice, and the Early Care and Education System in New York, and has decades of experience working in, supporting, and channeling resources to our most under-resourced communities. Gladys has been a key thought partner and go-to resource for all of our work. We're thrilled to have her leading this discussion today. Gladys?
Thank you, Vidya. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. We're here today with an amazing group of panelists who bring a diversity of expertise and experience to discuss the importance of creating a shared vision as a core element of taking on transformation of youth justice. In its simplest terms, to create a vision is to think about and plan with others the future with imagination and wisdom. Why is that important? Why does it matter? You can say, as a system leader, I know what needs to be done, and maybe you do, but it takes too much time, or people will not agree with me. Those are the things I hear a lot. But leading a change process is not a one-person show. It requires many people rowing in the same direction to create sustainable change, enduring and transformational change that will improve the well-being of young people who are captured in our youth systems. It's all about our young people and improving their well-being. That is possible when there is clarity of vision and purpose. As a former system leader, experienced in building coalitions and creating a shared vision across our efforts to transform our systems, changing the status quo is difficult, but when done in collaboration with clarity of vision, you're closer to achieving your goals. So let's hear from our panelists. Their distinguished bios are in the chat, and I'll do a short intro of each of them, and we'll start the conversation. Elijah Norris Holiday currently serves as the founder and executive director for Project Restore in Minnesota, a private nonprofit social enterprise serving young adults 18 to 24 residing in the Twin Cities. Steve Bishop is the associate director for probation and system transformation with the Annie E. Casey Foundation and part of the leadership team of its Juvenile Justice Strategy Group and Center for Systems Innovation. Steve's portfolio includes leading Casey's efforts to transform youth probation and the youth prison model and reduce inappropriate and unnecessary use of secure detention. Katie Weinstein Miller is the Chief Probation Officer for San Francisco Juvenile Probation Department. Katie is our resident system leader for this panel. She comes to juvenile probation following 12 years at the San Francisco District Attorney's Office, where she served as Chief of Programs and Initiatives. So welcome, each of you. Thank you for making time to share your insights, your experience, and what your challenges and successes have been as we all have gone down this road in one way or another of transforming systems. I'm going to start with Elijah. And Elijah, you're our young person on our panel. So from your perspective, what does a vision look like that really supports what we want for young people and families? And how do you build trust among the people, the different folks who should be involved in creating that vision and implementing a vision as partners to system leaders?
Thank you for those two questions, Gladys. I'm going to answer the second part of the question first, and then I'll address the first part of the question after I address the second part. So I believe it's essential to first to begin with having truthful and honest conversations about what the expectations, the parameters of engagement, and what the shared values are going to be that guide the work. And that should happen very early on in any partnership. There needs to be a certain level setting that needs to take place, and there needs to be a space for all the parties to have a thorough understanding of how the partnerships will operate, what the desired outcomes are going to be, and how to address differences in our approach and our values once those issues arise, because they will arise, right? Right? We're dealing with people who come from different walks of life, different areas of understanding, different subject fields, and we're not always going to agree, but there needs to be a certain level of commonalities that always bring us back together and to help guide our work. Having those conversations, I believe, are critical to initiating the process of building trust. However, just having the conversations alone will not solidify a trusted space. There must be a commitment from all the parties that regardless of our personal biases that we bring to the table, our preconceived thoughts, the prejudice that we all carry through life, but that there needs to be a certain level of understanding that the focus should always remain on transforming the system into an environment that positively impacts our youth, our young adults, and our families. And that brings me to answer the first part of your question is, how do we create that space and how do we create that vision? I believe it's essential to have those who have been impacted by the system at the forefront of this movement and in key leadership positions. You can't transform the system without having those people who've been negatively impacted by that system leading the work. And that looks like compensating them for their time. It looks like acknowledging their opinions and their voices and lifting it up in every space that you are in. They have to be in the driver's seat when we're transforming this system.
And Steve, how difficult has that been?
How difficult has it been to for system leaders to make that change?
Yes.
I think it's difficult because I think it requires definitely a sense of humility to both understand the ways that systems have harmed communities, particularly communities of color, over the decades, and to also be able to acknowledge that they can't do it alone. And so if we're really thinking about higher aspirations for transforming youth justice, not just not doing harm. So moving away from simply harm reduction, but really thinking about youth well-being in a very holistic way, then I think systems have to be honest with themselves. And systems can do a lot on their own to stop doing harm. They can, stop locking up kids for technical violations of probation. They can make concerted efforts to expand diversion, things of that nature. But to help young people thrive, to make sure they have the connections and opportunities in their home neighborhoods, those aren't things that systems are designed to do and haven't been good at. And so it really requires partnership with communities in a way that we haven't traditionally invested.
So Steve, you mentioned the whole notion of the harm that systems create. And Elijah, I'm wondering how important it is from your perspective that systems acknowledge that harm. And I'm gonna ask Katie, how has she dealt with that? Because I that's a real challenge. So Elijah, what do you think?
Gladys, I believe that it's critical for the systems to acknowledge the harm that they've caused and created inside of our communities, especially if they want to build sustainable partnerships with community. There needs to be a space where we can have that reconciliation from those systems to community, acknowledging the harm that they've created through disproportionate policies that they've created. I'm speaking specifically for my community. During the 90s, we saw a lot of disproportionate policies coming down between crack and cocaine, right? Where you'll get a larger sentence if you're caught with crack cocaine versus caught with regular cocaine or cocaine in its original form. You're getting 10, 15 extra years added onto your time. And that's a clear discrepancy just right there, right? So that's just one specific policy that caused a lot of negative impact in our community. And we're still seeing the ramifications of those types of policies in our community right now to this day. And those policies were being enacted in the 90s, right? So there needs to be an intentional effort from the system to acknowledge those harms if they really want to build sustainable relationships with community.
Katie, as you move as a system leader and you move to create a shared vision and you want it to be bold and transformative, how do you deal with the issue of acknowledging the harm that your system has caused? And is that an essential element of really trying to move forward and create a shared vision?
Thank you for the question, Gladys. And I'm really honored to be here with this group today. I do think it's incredibly important to acknowledge the harm, but I also think the way that you do it really matters. I mean, so I think naming it is incredibly important. I think system leaders actually talking about it and being open and willing to talk about it is important. But I think even more important is being willing to hear firsthand accounts from people. I don't want to fill this space and spend a meeting with people hearing me talk about how I think they experienced harm, right? I think that when you're sitting around a table in a position of power, you should be doing more listening than talking. And I do want to also uplift, what Elijah said about compensating people for their time. That's something that we do on one of our local groups here. So for community members who are spending time at the table helping us dream a new reality into existence, we value their time. They are experts. And we want to make sure that we're compensating them for that. So it's a combination of valuing what they have to say through their time and compensation, and then really setting a stage where their voice has a true guiding space around the table and in our conversations. I also think that part of our role is to be non-defensive as much as we can, right? When systems are listening and really absorbing that. And part of the way I think we can be non-defensive is to be transparent about what we've struggled with as a system. And I think to use our data to be transparent to show the harm we've caused. I think that, the numbers and the incredible disparities that we see of the young people impacted by our system speaks volumes to really showing in stark ways the harm. So that's a numbers way, that's not a personal way, but I think that combination together is really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm just wondering how in setting up a shared table, and I think system directors have to be willing to not be the only one that sets tables, right? And brings people together. And we need to be able to be open to that. I'm just wondering, in the process of creating that shared vision, and I'd like each of you to say why that's important. But in that process, there are going to be challenges and imbalance of power. And how do we deal with that? So I'll start with you, Katie, and then I'll move to Steve and Elijah.
Sure. I would tell you, I wrestle with this all the time, right? This question to me of how do we build a system that has kind of shared leadership in some ways, and also knowing when sometimes as government, I have the job of making the decision on something, right? I think both of those things are true at different times. I think genuine opportunities for input are really, really important. I think starting with a really broad vision together is really important. In my experience, when we can start from a place collectively of really asking, what do we want, right? What do we want the experience for our young people to be, and the people who love them, and the people they may have harmed? Like, what do we want that youth justice system to look like? When we have that, I find that we tend in our conversations here to have a lot of consensus at that highest level. I actually find that we have a lot of consensus when we talk about individual young people. And then I find that all the space in the middle is where there's so much tension and conflict, right? What are the policies? What are the actual ways that you operate the system day to day? Like the kind of meat of that is where we can have a lot of discord. So I think there's two things I would say that are important to me, and I think respond to what you're asking. One is that if we do have that high level vision, we're constantly trying to retether in those moments of disagreement up to what is it we're really trying to bring into reality for our young people. But the other thing that I think is really important, and it actually ties into what Elijah said about level setting, I think, is really providing an opportunity to educate anyone who's coming to the table around the kind of practicalities and parameters that we may be operating in, right? What are the laws, regulations, timeline issues, the kind of current things that can sound like bureaucracy, but I actually think it's an act of dignity and equity to say to anybody coming to the table, we're going to spend the time to make sure that you are aware of the constraints that may be affecting other people around the table, right? I think that when we don't build that shared knowledge, we actually produce greater rifts and distrust and harm. And I think that's especially true for young people who may be brought in with a sense of false hope about something when we don't do that collective level setting. So I think that is incredibly important. For me, we've tried a few different models over time here. Some very kind of collective models where we have equal numbers of folks around the table from the system, from community, having facilitated conversations. I think there's a great ability in those spaces for really kind of evenness of input. But at the end of the day, sometimes there's still going to have to be a decision-making process. And my best way I've tackled that is to be transparent with community members about what I think that process should look like, taking in their input, but sometimes being the one to make that call.
Steve, how would you respond?
Yeah, I think obviously it's messy work. Really the whole power sharing, shifting kind of the paradigm, shifting narratives. And so, adding on to both what Katie and Elijah talked about, that humility piece is really important to bring to it. And then that should kind of show in all the ways that you operate. And so when we talk about certain values and when we work with jurisdictions, Casey Foundation, we do a lot of training kind of around organizational culture and really being value-based. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One, we know that most people who work in the system come for the right reasons. They want to work with kids. They want to be helpers. They probably envision themselves, much as I did when I entered the field as a probation officer many years ago, seeing myself as a counselor and a mentor. And then like the system that they're asked to operate in is something very different and produces very different outcomes. And so when we really think about values around being explicit about race equity, that's not just reducing disparities, it's creating equal opportunities, it's compensating, as Elijah spoke to, compensating community members, young people for their time and valuing their input in very tangible ways. When we talk about family engagement, when we talk about community partnerships, and everything that means, it's also understanding it's not just saying it because it feels good, but because it's smart. It's a good way of doing business. There's a tactic to it. You're going to be better informed. You're going to have more information at your disposal about how your policies are impacting the people that you're intending to do well by. And so you're just going to make better decisions. And so it's really having those values, but understanding, again, that it's not just for the sake of saying we have this value. It's because it really is going to produce better outcomes. And with that, also having this notion of never being satisfied. Within the Casey Foundation, our founder often talked about this idea of constructive dissatisfaction and the idea that as soon as you feel like we're good enough, that's when you should be aware. We should always be pushing ourselves to do better. And so as long as we have systems operating, as long as we have young people who are in some carceral state, whether they're in an out-of-home placement, whether they're have probation supervision, an ankle monitor, you name it, you're going to have some people who are being impacted by the system and aren't satisfied. So there's always opportunities to do better if we're just listening and have the right people at the table.
Elijah, we're talking about setting that table. I'd love to get your input and also think about, do you feel that you're heard and that young people, when they sit in these tables, how do we overcome the imbalance of power?
Yeah,
Or is that possible?
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to speak on that Katie mentioned and Stephen mentioned as well. But before I mention that, Gladys, I'm one of those individuals where I'm going to continue to speak up regardless if people hear me or not. And I've been fortunate enough to surround myself around young people that take that same approach to the work that we do. We're going to be heard. But I want to start with a quote from James Baldwin before I get into the 2 points I want to talk. I believe this quote is very relevant to the space. James Baldwin said, "I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually." And Katie, you mentioned this earlier. We have to move from a state of when we receive that feedback or that criticism, the system, it's like an innate response that they have to get defensive. We have to move from being defensive when we receive that feedback and that criticism, because that feedback and criticism is what's going to really push us into a space of being better and doing better, right? So how do we get system folks to understand that when you get that criticism and that feedback from community, don't take it and become defensive, take it and try to move forward with it, knowing that this is going to make you better. It's going to make the people in your community better if you do take that feedback and criticism the right way. The second piece is something that Stephen spoke to, which is changing how we do business. I feel like that's essential. If we want to truly transform a system, we have to change how we do business. And I've seen various sites do business differently because of COVID-19, because they had to and they were forced to. And I challenge the system to continue to do that, right? It's like all of a sudden we were able to reduce these barriers when COVID came, but now that, cases are being dropped, it's like we're going back to the same way that we did business before. And I just challenge us to continue to move forward in this new way, because this new way seems to be working, at least in my county, it seems to be working. And another thing I want to speak on is what's happening in Ramsey County. I'm not sure what other counties are doing, what other jurisdictions are doing, but we're doing something very special here in Ramsey County. There's a new initiative under the Ramsey County Manager's Office named TST, Transforming Systems Together. And it's an intentional space where there's shared power between community members and system leads, and they come together and they share power in decision making. And specifically, the focus right now is on transforming our child protective services, our child welfare system, essentially. And then a part of that is also this JDAI work that we're doing. But that is a space where there's community members there, there's system leads there, and they all have the same amount of shared power and decision making in that process. And I think that's just so beautiful. And if we can copy and paste that model across the country, I feel like we'll truly start to see some transformation happening. So those are the two pieces that I want to offer into the space.
Steve, we're talking very specifically about jurisdictions. Katie's talking about her work in San Francisco, Elijah in Ramsey County. You have a much broader approach, right? You're looking at how do you impact the field? So how do you do that and stress the importance of having a shared vision and really articulating what the values and belief systems are? How do you do that across the country?
Yeah, it really is. It kind of come back to the same thing of like just trying to bring everyone to the table. And in some cases, it's different sets of stakeholders and trying to find those commonalities. So obviously the Casey Foundation, we've done a lot of work in sites over the years based on the tremendous success we've had with JDAI. And so that's created a network that we work from, but also understanding, particularly with part of my portfolio, when we talk about probation transformation, it's a real opportunity because you don't have to start a new program to transform juvenile probation. It's everywhere. It's already in all 3,000 plus counties across the United States. So there's a real opportunity there. And so demonstration in sites is always important as you're lifting up ideas, to have places that are actually putting those ideals into practice and are able to show the results. But then we've also thought about some other strands where we really want to be able to scale up and get some cohesion across the field in terms of this clarity of vision that we need to transform youth justice. So part of it is communications. So publications, blogs, lifting up the bright spots the places that are these demonstration sites, but really being strategic and intentional about communications to the field and opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. Because I could talk about it all I want to from the Baltimore offices in Casey, but folks learn best and value it more when they have that credibility. And so in the same way we talk about credible messengers for young people in the system, we all need credible messengers. And so a prosecutor is going to hear it best from a prosecutor, a judge from another judge, a chief probation officer from another chief probation officer. And so really having those communications that amplify the bright spots and share stories. And then also working with big national partners, so professional organizations that represent judges, that represent probation officers. So we've invested a lot of time and effort creating partnerships with like the National Council of Juvenile Family Court Judges, American Probation and Parole Association, organizations that have the credibility of their field, and as they're taking on a leadership role and making pretty decided efforts to say, we don't want to just reflect the field, we want to be leaders and help direct our constituencies in the ways that we know serve people, young people and communities best. Those have been important partnerships too. And there's been a real appetite across the board, we found, for folks who, though we've seen advances in the field over the last couple of years, still see that we have these horrible disparities. We basically have two different systems of justice in the United States. We definitely see disparities across the board with all kids of color, but particularly with Black youth and especially Black boys. We're really talking about two completely different systems of justice that we see in this country. And so it's encouraging to see that across the board, be it folks representing community organizations and advocates, all the way through to professional organizations representing judges and probation officers, there's a recognition that we just have to do better. Like, these disparities aren't good enough. We're not creating equitable opportunities for young people. And that's what these interactions with the justice system should be about, helping create a transformative experience for young people and changing their trajectory, not making things harder for them. And so I think you can find those common strands throughout. But again, it's like really broadening the table and listening to all parties, young people and families that are impacted, and people from professional organizations who, again, I think at their heart, they are well-intentioned and want to be helpers, but we all need to be able to hear from one another.
So true what you say, Steve. And I'm just here wondering, from each of your perspectives, and you've mentioned many of them, but I don't know how many system leaders feel they have access to Annie Casey, right? Supports, but I'm wondering from each of your perspectives, and Elijah, I'll start with you. What kind of supports do you think young people need to participate effectively in sitting at those tables to create a shared vision, of being able to articulate the components of what a vision, what your vision is for youth justice? What kinds of supports do you think that they need? And I'll ask Katie what kind of supports as a system leader she would need. And also, Steve, from your observations of what you see, what do we need to do to help system leaders get there? So often we hear that somehow creating the vision and having a shared vision is expendable, that it takes too much time, it takes too much effort, we need to do the work. And it just seems to me that we all agree that that's an essential component of moving forward. From your perspective, Elijah, what kinds of supports would be helpful to really move that forward?
Yeah, I don't believe there's a one-size-fits-all approach to providing supports to young people. Being someone that works closely with young folks involved in the juvenile detention center, and also that are at risk to be system involved, they all need different types of supports. I mean, ranging from just mentorship and some guidance, just someone to listen to and just to be there for them when they call, all the way up to housing support, right? A lot of the young people that we encounter don't have stable housing because their parents don't have stable housing. They need mental health support. They may have chemical dependency issues. So the services and the types of support that they need, it ranges and it differs based off youth to youth. And I feel like the system, they need to take a more individual approach to providing that support to young people. And you have to partner with community to do that. You can't be a system that punishes the young person, but also is the system to provide them with the support and service that they need. It's not going to work that way. You have to partner with community that have the connections with the young people in order to actually reach the young people and make sure that they get the support they need, but they also follow through once you make those connections with them. And we found a lot of success being able to work and leverage the resources from Ramsey County and from our other networks, government entities, philanthropy organizations, and also partnering with community members that are on the ground doing the work and have these relationships with the young people and making sure that our team has what they need to provide that support to that young person. And we've seen a lot of success with that model. So the system, they have to move past thinking that they can do it all by themselves. And they have to be intentional and deliberate and strategic with how they partner with community to provide that support to our young people.
Katie?
Sure. I think that for folks in this system, I do think that, what Steve was saying is exactly right. Like, credible messengers everywhere matter, right? And so folks who've done the work, who've been in probation, who came to the field and take great pride in being practitioners in this field, it really matters, I think, for them to hear from other people who've walked that walk about the personal change they may have gone through, understanding that different possibilities can work better for the young people they support and for their daily experience, right? Like how we can messenger that back in from people who've experienced the kind of transformation in the way that they operate systems, I think helps. I also think it's really important to acknowledge that it does take time and resources to make change. I said to my board of supervisors yesterday in our budget hearing, when we were arguing about whether to eliminate some positions here, that I think that we all need to commit to being the right size. And I will note that we are a department that's actually downsized by 20% in the last 3 years, right? Because of the lower numbers of kids coming through. But I don't think we're going to erode ourselves into transformation, right? That if you want probation, if you want the system to be doing things differently, you have to give people that access to knowledge, the space to try out and practice those new ways of doing things, the resources and support that they need to try to change their practice, right? Changing is hard. It's why it's so hard for the young people who come into our courtrooms too. And, I think that we want to invest in everybody involved in this system and this change. We need to give them what they need to make the change that we want to see in them. And I also want to acknowledge, and I saw a comment in the chat that reminded me that, I think that dignity and respect have to pervade all interactions as we do this system change. I think it is incredibly important that every young person, every community member who comes to the table experiences dignity and respect, and they feel heard. And I think it is incredibly important that every system partner that comes to the table have that that same experience. And I think it's been a big lesson for me here to really hear from some of the staff about the kind of personalizing of the ways that they've heard the system described in San Francisco, in parts in our conversations about transformation. There is a lot of hurt feelings and a lot of feelings of disrespect. And I have found that there is no expiration date on those feelings, that they come up for people in every conversation when we try to talk about doing something new, that the experience people have been through where they felt shut down and excluded, regardless of where they're coming from to the table, leads to a real paralysis and then talking about what's next.
Steve?
Yeah, yes, on everything that Katie and Elijah said. A couple of things I'll say in terms of, I think, what's needed. One is having, what this is all about, the clarity of vision, having really clear parameters for the formal system and what the population should be that they're serving, and again, what that purpose is. And so I think there's a need for both statutory, regulatory, administrative support. So to make clear distinctions about what young people should be diverted from formal system involvement by default and diverted to community-based organizations that should be the front line for most youth misbehaviors and things that come to the attention of the justice system in some form. So having those clear parameters also defining clearly like who should be on probation. That should be young people with serious offense histories, complex needs, young people who without some more intervention, might not get on the right trajectory that we want them on, but then also being clear that probation in particular and community supervision should be relationship-based, time limited, and primarily focused on building those connections and opportunities for young people. So I think having the right statutory, regulatory, administrative parameters in place would help system leaders, because probation in particular for so long has been the fallback for everything. It's for kids' first time offenses, and we want to like get their attention and teach them a lesson. It's for last chance for young people who've had repeat offense. It's kind of been the catch-all for everything. Kids who have slipped through the cracks of the child welfare system, school to prison pipeline, you name it. So we've asked our youth justice system to kind of be the catch-all, and some of the failures are predictable when you look at it that way. So I think that's one area. And then the other thing, just to Katie's point, is the resources. Absolutely. You need dedicated, innovative, nimble funding streams, so that we're constantly moving. Society's moving fast. One of the more beautiful things I've seen experienced is in Washington, D.C., and they have these achievement centers. And they're kind of safe spaces for young people who are in the system, where they bring in community partners to do everything from like having a recording studio for music, graphic design, and printing T-shirts to barbershop. But then also like healing circles, restorative justice processes are hosted there. So creating these types of spaces, but that requires innovation in a number of different ways. It means knocking down some of the barriers that keep people who've been impacted and been involved in the justice system out of being providers and being able to provide services to young people. So when we talk about credible messengers and folks that are with lived experience, so breaking down the barriers that preclude them from being compensated and being contracted with courts to provide services, making sure that we're not creating cumbersome funding streams and grant processes for the community-based providers we want to work with, making sure that we're really getting money and designing our funding streams in ways that it gets to the grassroots organizations that we know are there. The people in the community, they know who to go to when they have housing instability and food shortages and need some immediate relief. They know who those folks are, and organizations in the community. Systems need to do better with making sure we're getting the resources to those organizations, and in ways that don't require them jumping through all sorts of red tape and hoops and things that that distract them from doing the good work that they're doing. So that resource piece is kind of multifaceted in terms of making sure that it's getting to the community-based organizations that are going to be helpful. Also, that systems have the resources they need to provide incentives for young people where they're on probation. But again, it has to be nimble, because what the needs are and the desires for young people and families today are going to be very different 3 years from now. And so it has to be nimble and designed in a way that everyone has greater access.
As we, to your point, Steve, it seems to me that youth justice systems really can't do it alone. That a system leader needs to be able to interact with other leaders of systems and really leverage those resources that you need to have access, for instance, to the preventive services of a child welfare system, that you need to have access to housing, for the housing agency to house young people, that their needs are very varied. And it seems that in many instances, it's just the juvenile justice system that is called upon without bringing others to the table. And how do system leaders do that? Do they have a responsibility to do that? And how do they do that? Katie, you want to give that a stab?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a yes and, right? I think we do need to always be bringing to the table the other government partners that should be doing more prevention and support for our families. Public health, education, right? And then child welfare, all important. And I also think that our most significant partner in the work is community, right? Is the community organizations that in San Francisco, we are incredibly fortunate to have a very strong network of community organizations that are very, very well funded by the city, although I still think we need to work a lot on salaries for our CBO staff. But so I do think that the systems all need to be at the table, but I actually think when I think about our youth justice system, that immediate connection to a community-based organization at that first moment of interaction that a young person has with the justice system and then throughout should be a part of our system response. So I think that, to me, a really kind of really important challenge is how to recognize the community-based services and our grassroots CBO providers as part of our response, acknowledging that they also have some hard discussions within themselves about how much they want to be part of a system, right? And I say that because, you know, locally here, we have some real conversation about, like, when should probation be stepping back from the space? And part of my challenge to my CBO peers has been, well, how are you going to step forward, right? Do you want us to step out of certain spaces, telling the judge how your young person is doing, or coming up with a case plan, or checking to see if they're where the judge told them they need to be? Then what is your willingness and comfort level to be doing that work of sometimes supervision, right? And so I think it's both getting the system partners to the table, but it is really recognizing that our response should be more than the public agencies.
That's true. Elijah, I'm wondering, what do you feel? I mean, the role of the community and developing capacity in community. Are community organizations willing to step up and assume some of the responsibilities of government and really providing services to young people and supports, more important, supports in communities? I mean, we see transformation. I mean, in New York, for instance, we have the Neons, right? And which is a community space. And it's organized by Department of Probation and done wonderful work, but it's organized by the Department of Probation. Is that the role? Do we transfer all of that to community? And is that the vision? You know, and I think that gets around to having these transformational visions that does more than just reduce harm, right? And so I would love to hear what you think about that, Elijah.
Absolutely. And I think it's one of those things where it's not a one entity steps up and the other one steps back. I think it's one of those, it's a situation where we all have to move together and to understand when we need to lean on one another. And I believe that community, and I can speak specifically for my community. I don't know the environment of everyone else's community, but in my community in Ramsey County, I know community-based organizations are willing, able, and can step into this space and move with our systems to truly transform this environment that we have to create better outcomes for our youth and our young adults and their families. But again, it goes back to the point I made when I did my opening statement. Our community providers, they need to be compensated for their time. County people get paid nice salaries with benefits to do their job. And we expect community members to show up and to do this job with them, sometimes more than what they do, without fair compensation. And that's not sustainable. I don't think that's equitable, and it's certainly not fair. So I believe, yes, community can be in a better position to provide the services that we need to truly provide that wraparound support and guidance for our youth and young adults that are system impacted or currently in the system, but they need to get compensated fairly for that. And they also need to get the skills and resources that the county has to continue to create those sustainable changes in our communities. And from what I've seen, some community organizations have it, but a lot of them don't. So what ends up happening is they may get into a one-year contract with the county, but because they don't have a strong financial system in place, because they don't have specifics around what their scope of their work is going to be, because they don't have great administrative systems in place, they end up getting the contract for 1 year, and they may have some successes and some failures, but the county doesn't provide enough resources and support for that organization, and the contract's not renewed. And now we just missed a great opportunity to work with that community-based organization to get them to a level that we need them to be at to create adequate changes in our communities, but we dropped the ball. So how do we also, talk with system leads in our government to say, hey, if we want to contract with community, we have to make sure that they have the resources necessary to do this job adequately. And then the other piece is we have to focus on dismantling intergovernmental silos. It's ridiculous that we have a lot of folks, a lot of agencies in Ramsey County that don't communicate with each other. And I'm starting to see that we're starting to have more conversations. We're starting to focus on dismantling those intergovernmental silos, and it's working, right? We have law enforcement at the table now. We have our Ramsey County judicial branch at the table now. We have our Ramsey County Attorney's Office at the table now. I mean, we're working across numerous departments in Ramsey County to transform our youth justice system, and it's working. But first, we have to, dismantle those intergovernmental silos. It's critical to what we're trying to do here in this space.
Government always is trying to get services on the cheap, right? And they seem to think that community organizations can do it far cheaper than they can. And that's just wrong. I mean, it's investing in our young people, investing in our communities. And it really is not about who could do it cheaper, but who does it better. And that's the community. Steve, I'm wondering, is there a role for philanthropy? And Annie Casey assumes a large role in this space to align systems so that they do work to really promote the well-being of young people holistically. And it's one door rather than multiple doors. Or, I always thought that, as we said earlier, that my door, the juvenile justice or the child welfare, Rambo systems were those of last resort, and juvenile justice being where we put kids in the past anyway, forgot about them, right? So is there a role for philanthropy to really help align those systems to better serve young people?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is. I mean, I think there are limits on it that maybe most don't necessarily recognize because the reality is, I work at what's called our Center for Systems Innovation at Casey, and that includes our juvenile justice team. Also, our family well-being strategy group is focused on child welfare issues. And the reason we are focused on systems innovation is because we recognize that even with well-resourced philanthropies, that only goes but so far. So it really takes long-term the investment and commitment of public dollars to truly transform systems. But philanthropy, and I think we've tried to do that in terms of planting seeds where there's a lack of public funding to support innovations, to be able to seed some of those innovations and provide some resources and funding to get those off the ground, and hopefully, and to be able to demonstrate some of their effectiveness. One of our probation transformation sites is Pierce County, Washington, Tacoma, and they've done a lot of tremendous work with some of our, in hindsight, relatively small investments towards doing things like creating more incentives for young people in their community, being able to contract with community-based organizations in a different way. And so instead of just paying for 10 slots for 10 kids on probation, it's about kind of more general support to community-based programs, because that bike shop that is doing a program with kids on probation is also good for their peers and their siblings and the community as a whole. So really helping to try to make the community healthy. So I think there's a role for philanthropy in that. Certainly I talked about before communication. So identifying bright spots and being able to lift those up. And that's both in direct communications, social media, et cetera, but also site visits. And sometimes folks just need an opportunity to get outside of their bubble and be able to actually go somewhere and see something different and imagine it. And I think that's a space that philanthropy in Casey's been able to fill, is helping support some of those types of field trips, if you will, for system leaders to experience something different. And so I think there's definitely a role there, and convening. One thing we do well at the Casey Foundation is bringing people together. We sometimes do maybe more convening than anything else, but I think it's important for a number of different reasons to be able to, again, where there's not public dollars for it, to bring people together across different disciplines, or to bring in stakeholders who traditionally haven't had a seat at the table, to be able to gather information and data from them about what's going to be effective in transforming youth justice. And then also convening for the sake of peer learning. When I still worked in state government in Pennsylvania, it was one of the more powerful experiences of my career attending a JDI conference, to be around 1,000 other people in the country who are like-minded and want to see serious reform and transformation throughout our systems. And so those types of experiences are energizing for people. When you're in the day-to-day grind of system transformation, it can weigh heavy. So having opportunities to get around like-minded people can kind of buoy you and push you through the next year. And again, just the opportunity to learn from other folks about innovations and ways to work around some of the barriers that we all encounter.
So true. Steve, somebody just asked, what is JDI? I don't know if you quickly want to say what JDI stands for.
Sure. JDAI is our Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. Started about 30 years ago with 5 pilot sites. Now is in more than 300 jurisdictions across 40 states in the United States. Focused on reducing use of secure detention, kind of pre-adjudication and pre-disposition. And so that's kind of our flagship initiative, but has become much more, I would say, in recent years of a network as we've obviously expanded our purview beyond just detention reform, but really thinking about youth justice on the whole. So probation transformation and then the youth prison model, and really understanding that it's all interconnected. So that's become much more of like our network of jurisdictions and people and places that are in this long journey with us.
You know, I just couldn't help but thinking what you were saying about the convening and the conferences. And those are really spaces for people to learn from each other, and spaces to meet your colleagues, and spaces to have young people and community groups come and present and share information. But, you know, one of the challenges that I had, and I'm sure that Katie shares this, is that while I ran a huge system with a huge budget, had very little discretionary dollars, right? 99% of my budget went to supporting facilities. And so probably even less. So I had very, very little bit of money to be able to fund and do diversion, fund diversion, or go and visit places, or even go to conferences. Most of the time I wasn't even allowed to go, where there were travel restrictions during fiscal austerity times. So it's really important to recognize the kinds of supports that system leaders need, and also what the constraints are. That we have very bold visions, and it's really important to have these bold visions as we move and reimagine. But I think that we need to understand some of the constraints that we face, and how that sometimes we're not in a position to challenge those constraints, but others can. And I think that how we manage that is really important. But I think that there needs to be a recognition that while we have power, and I'm not denying that we have power, it is not almighty power that we have to just magically make the transformations. And it takes a lot of hard work, takes a lot of people working together. And really, you know, to Katie's point, the trust and approaching this work with humility, which you echoed, and really valuing the input of communities, impacted individuals, and the young people who we say that we're providing, you know, that these systems are supposed to help and support. I'm going to move in a couple of minutes to taking some questions, but I'd like each of you to just some last words about your advice. Once, I think we've all acknowledged that having a vision helps guide, inform the process. It brings people together. It really is about moving forward together and how we do that. But I'd like each of you to, what are the takeaways for system leaders, for advocates that are listening, for community members, for young people, and how we need to do this work and do it better? Elijah, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate my opening statement. You know, there needs to be a shared expectations, or at least the discussions of what the expectations of the partnerships would be. There needs to be clear parameters that are being set on how we are going to engage with each other. We need to understand that we need to have shared values while in that space, and that we need to create an environment where we can level set and make sure that we do have a foundation of how we're going to move forward in the work. And it's essential to have that foundation, because we're going to get distracted, right? There's so many things happening in our environments, but if we have a strong foundation, we know that we can always come back to the center to do transformative work on behalf of our youth, our young adults, and our families. The other thing is that we also have to be mindful that visionaries, they have to be optimistic and they have to be hopeful. But we also have to be realistic and practical about what we can and can't do based off of the constraints that we all have. So we need to make sure that when we're setting that table, that we have visionaries there, but we also have people there that can help us implement that vision.
Steve?
Yeah, I think there's so many kind of technical and practical aspects, but I think, I'm kind of a values person. And so I think holding that center, it becomes really critical. And then like that should kind of guide your actions from there. And so I think about, again, when I started my career as a probation officer, young adult, working with young people in the community I grew up in, that was in a community that was under-resourced and impacted by the system itself. And the best I could do was help young people navigate the system. And when I had young people who would say like, oh, the system's set up, like I didn't have any arguments with them. It was like, but let me help you navigate it. And so I was helping them beat the odds. But that's not good enough. And so what I would say, if we really want to transform our youth justice system, we have to move beyond the idea of just helping young people beat the odds, but be determined to use all of our resources and our power and position and authority to help change the odds, so that it's not a system that is catching you doing wrong, but is helping lift you up, that is helping you grow in healthy ways. I've seen a couple of things in the chat just about victims, and a lot of times we're talking about young people in communities that have been victimized by systems themselves. And oftentimes you do, and you look at, do a breakdown of communities. And oftentimes you're finding that the same folks who are perpetrating violence are also likely to be victims of violence. So we're not talking about things that are mutually exclusive there. And so it's really about how do we help change those odds though, and provide different types of opportunities, and think about what we will want for all of our children. I think about, I have sons and they went to school in a predominantly white school district. And while I wanted to make sure they were never disciplined harsher than their peers, that they had access to classes, AP classes and all those things, what I also wanted more than anything as a father is like when they mess up, and they do mess up, and they did mess up, that the adults in that building saw that as part of their job to give them all the love and nurture and support to grow healthily from their mistakes, to hold them accountable in ways that aren't just punitive, but that are actually will help resonate with them and change the trajectory of their life and all of those things. And so I think when we can really it's kind of cliche, the My Child test, but really think about what we will want for our own children and young people that we love, and really think about how we help change the odds versus a system where we're just helping them beat the odds.
It's absolutely true. I carry that standard all of the time. What would you do for your children? Right? And so why are we doing anything different for the children in our care and custody? Katie?
Yeah, and I think it's, just to Steve's point, our young people who come through have been the victims of so many horrible things. And also in this moment, there is someone who stands as a person harmed, right? Sometimes in the incident that brings them in. So I think I apply the My Child question to both, right? What do I want for this young person who's made a mistake and done something and committed harm? And if my child was the one who had been hurt and might be scared by something, what does that kind of restoration look like for them too, right? Because it is a response to things that have happened. I think a lot of what we need to build, but I would echo so much of what both folks have already said. And I would just add a few things. I think that it's okay to embrace iteration, even when we want to make sweeping change, right? And so I love that Steve was talking about the fact that there may be statute that needs to change, right? And like, I firmly believe we can do both things at the same time. And I think we probably all have been in that space of like, what change can we make today to improve the way we do our work? And to that point that was said, right, the probation is everywhere. You don't need to start a new program to change probation, but there's a lot we can do in all kinds of places, right? Pierce County was a great example. They did a lot of creative things with not a lot of investment, right? So what can we do right now within the current parameters to actually change the experience of our young people and families and people who've been impacted them? And with that broad vision on our parallel track, what big change are we moving toward? How are you changing the actual parameters for the future? So I think it's okay to have both and not be so paralyzed by trying to get to the big thing that you don't try to figure out the things along the way. I also think that it's okay to be time bound in some of your planning. I say that because there was an article in the San Francisco Chronicle this week about how San Francisco and our Daly City, which is to the south of us, in 2017, both embarked on processes to build housing for teachers, which we desperately need in this region. And 5 years later, Daly City is opening their housing and we are still in community discussions, but we have a name. So we managed to find a name that we all agreed on in San Francisco, but we don't have the housing for the teachers, right? So like, how do we be time bound and acknowledge that we do need to get things done? But what is the best way to ensure inclusion and participation within that time period? And then I think the last thing I would say, and this is a whole nother webinar, right, is that I really believe that the principles of procedural justice should be infused into the way we do business. So we know that when people feel that they've been treated justly, by police on the street or in a courtroom, that there's a sense of government legitimacy, that we feel like our government is there in our service. And there's elements that have been, studied and proven and make total sense to all of us to be those things, right? When you're treated with respect and dignity, when your voice is heard, when you view a decision maker as transparent and neutral and trustworthy, right? That you have a different experience. I think processes like this, I think tables that we set should have those principles undergirding them.
Absolutely.
The same way that I think our courtrooms do, and the same way that I think all government systems should. And I say that because I think since I'm the government stakeholder here today, I'll say that, I came to this work in large part because I want to change the way we do systems, but also because I deeply want to change the experience of legitimacy or lack of legitimacy that young people have with government. And so I think we want to make sure that the systems we create are infused with those things, but that then the table that we all sit around always needs to hold those principles at core.
Absolutely.
Because of our interaction with each other. So I think
absolutely fairness matters. So we're going to move now. I'm going to thank each of you. You've been great in really sharing your knowledge and sharing your thoughts and experience with us. We're going to move now to the questions, and we have a couple of questions already set up for us. And so anybody, take a stab. The first question is, while we model and recommend payment for youth and community expertise to system stakeholders, we sometimes get pushback. What are some responses and strategies you would recommend to address such resistance? So I would say that we should get Annie Casey to give us money to support that. That's the first thing I would say. But Katie, you've probably had the most experience.
I don't think we can really advance our racial equity work in San Francisco without acknowledging that most of the young people whose time we're asking of are young people of color. And I don't think that, and I think not supporting them to give us their time is fundamentally inequitable. So to me, I think that's the argument here, that is definitely very much an argument that's received well in San Francisco. So we haven't had that kind of pushback, I'll say that. The more interesting pushback we've had has been when community organizations have asked to be paid for their time at the table, but it's hours in the day that the city is already funding them for. And so how do you reconcile that?
Elijah, do you have any thoughts on that? Have you countered resistance in being able to compensate young people in your community? I think that we fund community-based organizations for very specific work, but we ask them to do 20 other things that are totally unrelated to what their contract states. And we fail to make that distinction, as somehow they have the capacity to do more, and somehow because we have a contract with them, they're beholden to us. And I think we need to be a lot more clearer about that. Elijah, any thoughts?
Yeah, I face that type of resistance all the time. Not so much lately. I'm thinking the specific contract we had with one of the departments where we wanted to pay young people to come to our personal and our professional development courses as they were going through their internships. So these were supplemental workshops that they would come to in addition to their internships. And there was some pushback at first to pay them additional money because they were already getting paid to go to the internship. But I just made the case that if we're requiring them to show up and get additional education, that we should compensate them for that time. You know, anything that the system members do, they get paid for it. Now, sure, they may volunteer outside of work hours and those types of things, but anything that's work related, they're getting compensated for, or they're on salary. So they're getting paid to do that work. And we shouldn't expect anything differently when it's time to, you know, work with our young folks or work with community members. They need to get compensated.
Yeah. You know, one of the strategies that I used in the short run was really to try to look for private dollars to support that initially and then build a model and then make the case to be able to then be able to elicit government support for it, to show that this works, this is what makes a difference. And, you know, then I would be more successful in being able to put it into my budget and convince the budget folks that this was important and important to do. The next
and
question.
A lot of times,
Steve,
sorry,
yeah, sorry.
One more piece I want to add in there is that the other piece also is it's how you phrase certain things. I've learned that in my time of doing this work. So you can't really, sometimes you can't say, oh, I'm going to pay a young person a wage, right, or a salary to do this job, but I can give a young person a stipend. And it's the same thing. It's just phrasing things differently. And for some reason, the government, they're fine with giving people stipends. But when you say that you're going to give them a wage, it's, oh, no, you can't do that. So it's becoming strategic in knowing what language to use to really get things done. And, you know, I follow behind one of my elders and long lost mentors, Malcolm X. I still watch his old videos and read his books and read any of his speeches. By any means necessary. So if you want to get something done, you'll figure out a way to get it done.
Good point. Steve, anything you want to add?
Yeah, no, just to your earlier point about your earlier question about the role of philanthropy, and certainly, you know, providing seed money for innovations, new funding streams, filling the gaps where it's not, you know, where you can fill those resources, I think is one role, but it has to be that commitment there to really sustain it, because that can just be counterproductive to start something for a year. And Katie's made the point, and I really appreciate from her, you know, her current role and her prior role, understanding the mistrust that exists between communities of color, communities that have been most impacted, and formal systems, be it from law enforcement, probation, prosecutors' offices, et cetera. And so to that point about trust, you have to have the commitment to sustain these types of practices and the resources to keep people engaged. So philanthropy could fill that on the front end, but that can't be the long-term solution. There really has to be the commitment. Some of it is maybe reminding public officials, especially those who are elected, that community doesn't just have one look and come from one socioeconomic background, that there's lots of voters and they're all community and are part of your electorate, and people in communities who are powerful and known very well by those constituencies. So I think reminders of that are important, that people all the way down, up and down, individuals and grassroots organizations should really exercise their political power and making sure that their voices are heard and that they're advocating for that as well. And some of it is, I think, for systems really demonstrating the impact. So even when you can do it with little or no cost, but bring young people and families to the table and co-design processes with them, make changes in practice that have a positive impact on both the outcomes that you're getting with young people, but also can demonstrate through qualitative type surveys that young people come out of the system with more hope, that families feel more engaged and feel more respected and heard. Those are all data points that can be used to make the case for the types of resources that are needed as well.
Good point. The next question is, I've often seen discrepancies between vision and how it's operationalized. What causes this to occur and how can it be addressed? Katie, I see you nodding.
Well, I mean, I do think some of that is because sometimes during visioning, if we're not also being transparent about the parameters and that we may not be able to work around currently, that things will get translated in a way that feel very unsatisfying to folks who may have been around that table. And so that's why I think it's important from the beginning to make sure that people understand that we can be working toward a very high level and long-term vision, but that these are the steps along the way that we may be tackling the work. And those initial steps may not feel satisfying to you in your quest for the long-term vision, but they may be the way to get there. I just think that transparency is key. I will say in San Francisco, where the process is trying to close down our current juvenile hall, that, you know, the actual legislation that the board passed said that we would still have a, you know, more home-like, still secure setting that met state and federal law, right? So we've been on that process. But for a lot of particularly young people who've been involved in it, the narrative around it was that we weren't going to have the juvenile hall. And so that there's such deep hurt now within our community, particularly by young people saying, why are we talking about having something to replace it? I thought we weren't going to have anything. And so I think if you don't start the visioning by making sure you all really are clear, it's exactly what Elijah said on level setting. It's just to your peril.
Anybody else want to add anything?
Yeah, I will say culture, organizational culture, I think is probably, at least from my perspective, the biggest barrier. And I've seen examples where you have really strong leaders, really strong leadership teams, and they're pushing reforms and new policies and practices from the top down, but it hits a wall. And so even if you put measures in place and say, we're going to review every case before it goes into detention, you can do those things, but until all the staff are bought into it, so that you don't need the gatekeepers to say, have you considered alternatives? Have you done X, Y, Z? Then you're just going to be hitting a wall. And so even when you have strong leadership that has a North Star and says, we're going to go this way, you have to engage staff, because as the saying is, culture eats practice. And so, you know, you have to really get the hearts and minds of everyone. And even if you're doing great work to engage community partners and find alternatives to, you know, formal system responses, incarceration, and all those things, if staff aren't really brought into the vision, if they don't equally, as much as we say with community partners, et cetera, if they don't feel heard in the process, bringing their own unique perspective and lens to it, then it just feels like something is being done to them. And over time, staff will, we talk about the black box of probation, and as Katie knows well, there's a lot of corners, a lot of rocks to overturn. So unless you really have people bought in, there's all sorts of ways that the good work that you're intending to do can be undermined on a day-to-day basis.
That's true. Elijah, anything to add?
Yeah, my 2 cents into this kind of conversation is my dad used to always tell me, too many dreamers in the room, everyone stays asleep, right? And what I mean by that is if you have too many visionaries in the room, too many big dreamers, nothing actually ends up ever getting done, right? So it goes back to the point I made earlier, you have to balance the table. There has to be people who are big thinkers, the visionaries, the folks who are optimistic, but there also needs to be that counterbalance of people who are pragmatic, people who understand implementation, and people who can take those big ideas and actually transfer it into actionable steps and actionable items. I mean, I think that's how you bridge that gap. That's how you solve that problem. Everyone can't be dreamers in the room.
I'm going to use that in every meeting I go into. I will say that what I've been saying to everybody is like, we need to be imaginative, but not magical, right? And I think what you just said captures it even better. So please thank you for your father for that.
The other question is, what's the best way to address system restrictions, such as regulations and law and procurement rules that could potentially derail creating trust and realizing a shared vision? And I think we touched a little bit about that. I think, Katie, you talked about transparency and setting the parameters early on in the process. And so did you, Elijah. Do you want to say something more about that?
I think the only thing I would add to it is we always need to also ask ourselves whether we have interpreted restrictions in a certain way over the years for so long that they've just become gospel to us, right? I think we need to always go back, look at language, ask ourselves whether there's ways to read it differently. And then if not, right, then what do we need to change?
I remember being trained as a lawyer never to say no. There always is 10 ways to do something. Let's just find the most effective one way to do it. And so that's always guided my work is there has to be a way around it. You just need to find it. Let me see if there are any other questions. What is the role of staff in the shared vision, and how do we deal with issues of public safety in the community? I don't know if those two questions are related, two parts are related, but we didn't talk about staff being part of a shared visioning process. Katie, you want to address that from your perspective?
Yeah. No, I think staff absolutely need to be at the table. And that goes back to something I said early on about how we've been having these work groups lately that have been 5 probation staff and 5 folks from community kind of hammering through what does case planning look like? How do you figure out how to work together? What a young person, their family need? So we've been really trying to do that with staff from throughout the department, right? From both our detention center and our probation staff at that table, line staff doing the work every day. I would say, I don't think that's enough. So one way we've tried to also add an additional layer of support is that our staff may be going into those tables and having those meetings, but then I also have internal meetings with our department staff participating in that effort to say, how's it going for you? What, where do you need more support? Reflect back to me how you're experiencing the meetings so that we give them space to kind of like exhale afterward and raise any issues that they may have. But I think it's really hard. And staff also have full-time jobs, right? So when we ask people to step aside from supporting young people to spend a lot of time in a planning meeting, then they're not necessarily supporting the young people as much that they're working with. So I think it's really, I think it's a really hard thing to do. I will say that we didn't do that well here in some ways in San Francisco. And as I noted earlier, it just has, it's really created rifts in trust for the staff here as well. And we have a lot of repair work to do on that.
Elijah, I'm curious, how do you deal with that from a perspective of you run your own community-based organization, and how do you bring people together to have a shared vision?
Yeah, well, very early on, I acknowledge what people's strengths are and what their weaknesses are. And I try my best not to put people in spaces that bring out their weaknesses, but bring out their strengths. And also take into consideration what their values are, what they want to do, what they're most interested in, and what drives them as a person. Because if you put a person into a space that's just not interested in being in that space, nothing's going to get done. They're not going to be disengaged. They're going to be uninterested. And then that's not beneficial to the organization or the people that are supposed to be being served. So that's the approach that I take, understanding the assets that I have at the table, understanding the strengths of the people that I have around me, and putting them in spaces that bring out those strengths, those assets that they bring to the table. Just understanding your staff, understanding where you need to place people, and understanding that not everyone belongs in every space. That's the approach that I take in this work. And staff play a very critical role in bringing out the vision, right? But some of those staff, they're involved in those visioning sessions. Some of the staff, their strength is implementation, and they're involved in the implementation process, and that's where they should remain.
Steve, do you have anything to add to that? I know that Casey does a lot of training.
Yeah, I mean, we typically in jurisdictions we work with, particularly with our probation work, my background for probation, we do a lot to try to make sure we're tapping into both the aspirations of line staff, like, again, what brought you to the work, and does the last week of work look like what you envisioned this to be? And most times we hear no, like, nope, I'm doing something very different than I wanted to do. So like, then unpacking that and like, what would it take? Like, what are the specific policy barriers in place? What are the other considerations in place for you to be able to bring your full self to the work? And so, yes, it is engaging folks at different levels where they are, having them part of like planning committees, part of implementation committees. It's also just understanding informal authority and understanding that being able to kind of take the converted and have them be part of the choir is very powerful. And not necessarily on a stage, but just around the water cooler in the office. That's extremely powerful to have people to say like, nah, I thought that this was the flavor of the week, but this is actually a better way of doing things. And this actually makes my job easier. It feels more rewarding to me and all of those things.
Those
And so,
champions, those
yeah,
quiet
so-
champions, on the staff.
Yep. Absolutely. So, we try to tap into that by doing focus groups, by doing purpose sessions, like literally having like conversations about purpose of probation, to really unpack that and get some consensus across staff on how you build that. So those things are important. The only other thing I'll add is as we're moving the work, it's important to keep checking in with staff and making sure that operationally we're being nimble to attend to their needs as well. If we're being successful and we're diverting more young people from the system that can be and should be diverted from the system, then we're going to have a tougher population of young people and circumstances that are on probation. And there's secondary trauma that comes with that. It's different. It may be a smaller caseload, but it's a bigger workload in some respects. And we have to understand that and honor that with staff. So similarly, if we're asking them to work non-traditional hours, whether it's to do home visits or attend meetings in the community or to just be part of the fabric of the community, then we have to also make accommodations because they have their own families and life, and we all need to maintain the work-life balance. And again, to bring their best selves to the kids and families they're supposed to serve, they need to be healthy and whole themselves.
And I couldn't agree with you more. And I think another element is that we have to acknowledge the fear that some people have of change and how we help them understand that and how the change is going to impact on them. The unknown is very frightening for many people. And government has a tendency to do things the same way forever, even when they don't work. And we know that they don't work, but we continue to do them despite that. So it's really important to acknowledge that and really have resources to be able to deal with that through communications, different ways. I want to thank each of you. We're at our end of our webinar. There is a request, and it would be great if you folks could identify any resources or podcasts or any recommendations you have for further training. If you let us know, we will share it with the audience. Everybody's eager to learn more. And so just let us know at the Justice Lab if there's any particular work that training or readings. Elijah, people loved your quotes. So please let us know and we will share with everybody in the audience. So I want to thank each of you again, and I want to thank the audience for being part of today's webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.